The marble floors of Hale Dynamics' lobby gleamed under cold white lights as the scent of lemon disinfectant drifted quietly through the empty midnight air. Daniel Reyes moved slowly across the polished surface, guiding a mop with careful, practiced strokes. The long handle creaked softly in his hands. Above him, the 40-foot glass wall revealed a skyline glittering with restless corporate ambition. Outside, rain traced thin silver lines down the windows. Inside, the building hummed with servers, security systems, and the silent machinery of a billion-dollar company that never truly slept. Daniel worked without hurry. Most nights were like this, quiet, unnoticed, predictable. Exactly the way he preferred it. His gray uniform hung neatly on his broad shoulders, sleeves rolled just enough to reveal strong forearms. The name tag clipped to his chest simply read D. Reyes. No one here had ever asked what the initials stood for. Few people asked janitors many questions. And Daniel had learned long ago that invisibility could be a kind of safety. Still, there were moments, brief ones, when the building itself seemed to whisper questions. Like tonight. Because on the far wall above the security desk, one of the network status monitors flickered with a strange sequence of alerts. A pattern. A subtle one. Something that most people would never notice. But Daniel noticed. His mop slowed. For a moment, his eyes lingered on the screen. And deep inside his memory, buried under years of quiet survival, something stirred. What Daniel Reyes had done 15 years earlier to end up pushing a mop through corporate hallways was something no one in this building could have imagined. Not the receptionists. Not the engineers. And certainly not the woman whose name was etched across the glass entrance doors. Victoria Hale. The rain intensified outside. Daniel lowered his gaze and continued mopping. Some stories were safer when they stayed buried. 2 floors above the lobby, the atmosphere was anything but quiet. Voices carried down the marble stairwell, sharp, confident, expensive voices. Investors. Executives. And at the center of it all was Victoria Hale. Even before she appeared, her presence seemed to bend the building around her. Her heels struck the marble staircase with precise, impatient rhythm. Click. 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 Victoria Hale descended into the lobby surrounded by men in tailored suits and women holding sleek digital tablets. Her dark blazer was perfectly cut, her posture straight as glass, her expression sharpened by years of boardroom warfare. At 39, she had built Hale Dynamics into one of the fastest-growing cybersecurity firms in the country. Investors called her brilliant. Competitors called her ruthless. Employees simply called her the boss. Daniel stepped quietly aside, letting the group pass. Victoria barely glanced in his direction. Her attention was fixed on the large presentation screen near the reception desk. "This is where we'll demonstrate the system," she said crisply. An assistant nodded nervously and tapped commands on a tablet. The screen flickered. A sleek digital interface appeared: network maps, encryption layers, real-time threat monitoring. Victoria turned to the investors with a confident smile. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, "what you're seeing is the future of corporate security." Daniel wrung his mop into the bucket. The water rippled softly, and his eyes drifted again to the screen. Something wasn't right. At first it was small. A delay between network responses. Then a faint loop in the diagnostic display. Daniel frowned slightly. He stepped closer. Not close enough to interrupt. Just close enough to see clearly. The assistant continued explaining the system architecture, but the display froze suddenly. The elegant network diagram blinked. Then reset. Victoria's smile tightened. "Restart the interface," she said. The assistant tried again. The screen flickered once more. Then froze again. A few investors exchanged uneasy glances. Victoria's voice hardened. "What's happening?" I'm not sure," the assistant stammered. Daniel watched quietly. The pattern on the screen confirmed what he had already suspected. It wasn't a glitch. It was a vulnerability. A subtle one. But dangerous. Daniel hesitated. For a moment, he considered saying nothing. Invisible men rarely benefited from speaking. But something inside him, something older than caution, refused to stay silent. He stepped forward slightly. "Excuse me," he said gently. The room turned. Executives stared as if the mop itself had spoken. Victoria's eyes narrowed. "Yes?" she said coldly. Daniel kept his voice calm. "The diagnostic loop is repeating," he said. "It looks like the authentication layer is cycling back into the handshake protocol." Silence fell. The assistant blinked. Victoria stared at him. Then laughed. Not loudly, but sharply enough that the investors joined her. "A janitor," she said slowly, "is explaining my security architecture." More laughter. Daniel stood still. "The system might be vulnerable to packet injection," he continued quietly. Victoria's expression hardened instantly. "Enough." Her voice cut through the lobby like glass. "You mop floors," she said. "You do not analyze cybersecurity systems." Daniel nodded once. "Yes, ma'am." But he didn't look embarrassed. That seemed to irritate her even more. One of the investors smirked. Victoria turned to the security desk. "Remove him." The guard hesitated. "He's interfering with an investor demonstration," Victoria snapped. "Get him out of here." The guard approached Daniel awkwardly. "Sorry, man." Daniel placed the mop back into the bucket. "No problem." He removed his gloves slowly and set them beside the wringer. The investors watched with quiet amusement. Victoria had already turned away, dismissing him from existence. But as Daniel walked toward the glass exit doors, his eyes lifted once more toward the frozen presentation screen. For a brief moment, something unreadable passed across his face. Not anger. Not humiliation. Recognition. Because the vulnerability he had spotted in seconds was not an accident. It was something far worse. And if Daniel Reyes was right, then Hale Dynamics wasn't demonstrating the future of cybersecurity tonight. It was exposing the beginning of a disaster. The rain pounded harder against the glass as Daniel stepped out into the cold night air. Behind him, the doors closed softly. Inside the building, the investors continued their tour. And none of them realized that the quiet janitor they had just thrown out might be the only person who understood what was about to happen. Or why. The conference room on the 32nd floor smelled faintly of burnt coffee and overheated electronics. 4 years had passed since the night the janitor had been escorted out of Hale Dynamics, and the building now felt different, heavier somehow, like a structure carrying secrets it could no longer support. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, winter clouds pressed low over the city skyline. Snow drifted sideways in thin white ribbons, blurring the towers beyond. Inside, Panic sat quietly at the table. Victoria Hale stood at the head of the long glass conference desk, one hand braced against the polished surface. Her reflection stared back at her from beneath the overhead lights, sharper now, harder than it had been 4 years earlier. Success had made her richer, but pressure had made her colder. Around the table sat the board of directors, senior engineers, and 2 representatives from the investment group that had poured nearly $1 billion into Hale Dynamics' security platform. Every screen in the room displayed the same thing. Red alerts. Scrolling system failures. Encrypted network traffic that no one in the room could explain. The company's flagship security architecture, the very system Victoria had once proudly demonstrated to investors, had been breached. Not crashed. Not glitched. Breached. And worse than that, whoever was inside the system wasn't stealing data. They were studying it. Learning. Testing. Waiting. Victoria's voice cut through the room. "How long has this been happening?" The chief systems engineer shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "We believe the intrusion started 3 weeks ago." Victoria's eyes hardened. 3 weeks? We didn't detect it immediately. The attack pattern is unusual. Unusual, Victoria repeated flatly. On the largest screen, lines of code scrolled like rainfall. The engineers had been staring at them for days. No one understood the pattern. except the person who had written something disturbingly similar years ago. But none of them knew that. Victoria turned to the investors. "We've brought in outside consultants," she said. "They're reviewing the system architecture." One of the investors leaned forward. "Have they found anything?" The room fell quiet. The engineer hesitated, then slowly tapped his tablet. A new window opened on the central display. A video connection request. Victoria frowned. "This is the consultant?" "Yes," the engineer said. "One of their analysts." The video connected. For a moment the screen showed nothing but a dim office lit by a desk lamp. Then the camera adjusted. A man sat in front of several monitors. He wore a plain dark sweater. Behind him were shelves filled with technical manuals and scattered notebooks. His hair was slightly grayer than it had been 4 years earlier. But his posture was the same. Calm. Unhurried. Daniel Reyes looked into the camera. None of the people in the room recognized him immediately. Except one. Victoria's eyes narrowed slightly. There was something about the voice when he spoke. Something familiar. "Good afternoon," Daniel said. His tone was steady and polite. "I've reviewed the network logs your team provided." The engineer leaned forward eagerly. "And?" Daniel glanced briefly at one of his screens. "The breach isn't random," he said. "It's methodical." Victoria crossed her arms. "That much is obvious." Daniel continued as if she hadn't spoken. "The attacker isn't targeting data. They're mapping your authentication architecture." One of the board members frowned. "Why would they do that?" Daniel's fingers tapped a few keys. The main screen changed instantly. A complex diagram appeared: network pathways, encrypted tunnels, layered security gateways. Except now there were red circles scattered across the structure. Precise ones. Daniel spoke calmly. "These nodes represent entry points into your system's handshake protocol." The chief engineer stared at the screen. "That's impossible. Those nodes are encrypted." "They are," Daniel said. "But your authentication layer cycles every 7 seconds. The engineer blinked. "Yes, that's standard redundancy." Daniel shook his head slightly. "No," he said softly. "It's a vulnerability." The room grew still. Daniel highlighted a section of code. "When the handshake resets, the system briefly reopens the packet verification channel." Victoria's voice cut in sharply. "Our engineers designed that architecture." Daniel nodded. "Yes." He zoomed in further. "And the attacker has been injecting diagnostic packets during that 7-second window." A long pause followed. One of the investors leaned forward slowly. "Are you saying someone is using our own security system against us?" Daniel met the camera calmly. "Yes." The engineer whispered under his breath. "That would require someone who understands the architecture intimately." Daniel didn't respond. Instead, he opened another file. New data flooded the screen. Timestamps. Packet traces. Network echoes. For 3 days Hale Dynamics engineers had tried to map the breach. Daniel had done it in under 2 hours. The boardroom went quiet. Not the casual silence of people waiting to speak. A heavier silence. The kind that arrives when something impossible has just been explained too clearly. Victoria studied the man on the screen. Her memory tugged at something. A voice. A moment. Rain on glass. A janitor speaking quietly about authentication loops. Her expression tightened. "Who are you?" she asked. Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he continued examining the network diagram. "The attacker hasn't taken anything yet," he said. "But they could." He highlighted the core server cluster. "If they access this layer." He paused. Then looked up at the camera. "They could shut down every system your company operates." The investors exchanged uneasy glances. Victoria's voice hardened. "Can you stop it?" Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair. The desk lamp cast a soft shadow across his face. "Yes," he said. Another silence. "But there's a complication." Victoria narrowed her eyes. What complication? Daniel turned one of his monitors slightly, studying the data again. The breach pattern suggests the attacker didn't discover the vulnerability by accident. Victoria's fingers tightened against the table. Then how? Daniel looked back into the camera. His expression was calm, almost thoughtful. Because the flaw was obvious, he said. And for a brief moment, just one, Victoria Hale saw the lobby again. The rain. The investors laughing. A quiet janitor speaking carefully about authentication loops. Her breath slowed. Wait, she said quietly. The room turned toward her. Victoria stepped closer to the screen. Her eyes searched Daniel's face. 4 years had changed him. But not enough. Have we met before? She asked. Daniel didn't smile. He simply held her gaze through the camera. And for a moment that stretched across the entire room, neither of them spoke. The silence grew thick. Heavy. Uncomfortable. Finally Daniel said one quiet sentence. Yes. And the room went completely still. Morning light crept slowly across the small kitchen table, warming the chipped ceramic mug beside Daniel Reyes's hand. The apartment was quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant rumble of city buses beginning their routes below. The smell of toasted bread lingered faintly in the air. Daniel sat at the table with a laptop open before him, the glow of its screen reflecting faintly in his eyes. Lines of network logs scrolled down the display. The Hale Dynamics breach. He had not slept much. Not because the problem was difficult, but because the past had a way of arriving when it was least convenient. Across the room, a teenage girl sat cross-legged on the couch, her dark hair pulled into a messy bun as she flipped through a thick physics textbook. Sophia Reyes looked up occasionally, chewing the end of a pencil while studying a page of equations. You're staring again, she said casually. Daniel glanced over. Am I? Yeah, she said. That look you get when something's complicated. Daniel smiled faintly. It's just work. Sophia closed the textbook. You always say that. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair. Outside the window, pale sunlight caught the edges of frost along the fire escape railing. You have a test today, he said. Physics. You'll do well. She shrugged. Probably. Then she studied him for a moment. You look like you did when you were helping me with the robotics competition. Daniel raised an eyebrow. That bad? Worse, she said with a grin. For a moment, the room felt lighter. Simple. Normal. Daniel closed the laptop. School bus in 20 minutes. Sophia stood and grabbed her backpack. At the door she paused. You're not going back to janitor work, right? Daniel shook his head gently. No. She nodded once. Good. Then she left, her footsteps echoing softly down the stairwell. The apartment returned to silence. Daniel reopened the laptop. On the screen, the Hale Dynamics network diagram waited like an unfinished conversation. And somewhere across the city, Victoria Hale was finally beginning to understand something she had missed 4 years earlier. The executive office at Hale Dynamics overlooked the entire financial district. Victoria Hale stood at the window, staring down at the streets 30 floors below. Traffic crawled between towers of steel and glass. Power. Money. Control. All of it had always made sense to her. Until yesterday. Her assistant entered quietly. We ran the consultant's identity. Victoria turned. And? The assistant placed the tablet on the desk. Daniel Reyes? Victoria stared at the name. The assistant continued carefully. He worked for ArcLight Systems 15 years ago. Victoria's eyes narrowed. She knew the company. ArcLight had once dominated government cybersecurity contracts. What happened to him? The assistant hesitated. He exposed internal fraud tied to a defense contract. Victoria frowned. And? He refused to sign a non-disclosure agreement. The assistant tapped the tablet. A news article appeared. The headline was old. Senior architect whistleblows major security contract fraud. Victoria scanned the page quickly. Daniel Reyes had reported that Arclight Systems knowingly deployed flawed encryption protocols in federal infrastructure. The report triggered investigations. Executives resigned. Contracts collapsed. But something else had happened too. Daniel Reyes had been quietly blacklisted. The assistant spoke again. 3 months after the investigation, his wife died in a car accident. Victoria looked up sharply. He left the industry shortly after. And became a janitor, Victoria said quietly. Yes. Victoria turned back toward the window. Pieces of memory slid together slowly. The quiet voice in the lobby. The calm explanation. The humiliation. Why is he working for the consulting firm now? She asked. He joined 2 years ago under a contract analyst role. Victoria's lips tightened. And he solved our breach in 2 hours. The assistant said nothing. Victoria returned to the desk. Prepare a contract, she said. For him? Yes. What kind? Victoria's eyes hardened slightly. An exclusive one. Daniel noticed the shift almost immediately. At noon, his laptop chimed. An encrypted message appeared. Hail Dynamics Executive Contract Proposal. He opened the document slowly. The numbers alone were staggering. 7 figures. Full authority over the breach response. But there was something else hidden deeper in the contract language. Liability. Legal responsibility for any consequences related to the breach. Daniel leaned back in his chair. It was clever. Very clever. If the breach turned catastrophic, the consultant would take the fall. He closed the document. Then his phone rang. Victoria Hale. Daniel answered calmly. Yes? Her voice was smooth. Professional. Mr. Reyes? She said. It seems we have unfinished business. Daniel waited. I'd like to bring you on directly. She continued. Your expertise could resolve this quickly. Daniel glanced again at the contract. The liability clause is interesting, he said. Silence. Then Victoria replied coolly. A precaution. For you, Daniel said. Her voice sharpened slightly. You should consider the opportunity carefully. Daniel thought of Sophia walking out the door that morning. Of the years spent rebuilding a quiet life. I already have, he said. And? I won't sign it. The silence on the line turned colder. You realize the breach will eventually require legal accountability, Victoria said. Yes. And investigators will examine everyone who touched the system. Daniel's voice remained calm. I assumed they would. Victoria leaned back in her office chair. Then perhaps you should reconsider, she said slowly. The implication hung in the air. Daniel didn't respond immediately. Instead, he opened a separate folder on his laptop. A collection of archived server logs. Copies. Backups. Time-stamped records of Hail Dynamics network activity. Records he had quietly downloaded the moment he began analyzing the breach. He closed the folder again. You should fix your authentication loop, he said. Then he ended the call. Across the city, Victoria stared at her silent phone. Anger flickered behind her eyes. If Daniel Reyes would not cooperate, then he would become the problem. 2 hours later, a news alert began circulating online. Cybersecurity consultant linked to Hail Dynamics breach. Daniel saw the headline appear on his laptop screen. He read the article quietly. The accusation was subtle, carefully worded. But the implication was clear. The consultant who had first analyzed the breach might also have created it. Daniel closed the laptop slowly. Outside, the afternoon sky darkened with approaching snow. And somewhere inside Hail Dynamics, Victoria Hale believed she had just forced the quiet analyst into a corner. What she didn't realize was that Daniel Reyes had already prepared for the moment when the world tried to bury the truth again. The interrogation room smelled faintly of stale coffee and cold metal. A single fluorescent light hummed overhead, casting a harsh white circle across the steel table. The rest of the room remained dim, its corners swallowed by shadow. Daniel Reyes sat calmly in the metal chair, his hands folded loosely in front of him. Across the table, two federal investigators reviewed a stack of printed reports. Outside the small reinforced window, snow tapped softly against the glass. The city had awakened to the story that morning. Every financial news network was repeating the same headline. Cybersecurity consultant under investigation in Hail Dynamics breach. The narrative had spread quickly. The mysterious analyst who had appeared just days before the breach was exposed. The consultant with deep knowledge of the company's architecture. The man who might have engineered the attack himself. Daniel watched the investigators quietly. Neither man looked particularly convinced. But procedures had to be followed. One of them flipped another page. "You worked for Arclight Systems," the investigator said. "Yes." "You exposed contract fraud." "Yes." "And afterward you left the industry." Daniel nodded. The second investigator leaned forward slightly. "And 4 years ago," he said, "you were employed as a janitor at Hail Dynamics." "Yes." The investigator studied him carefully. "Did you access company systems during that time?" "No." "Did you ever attempt to analyze their network architecture?" Daniel considered the question, then answered truthfully. "I noticed a vulnerability." The first investigator raised an eyebrow. "And you didn't report it?" "I tried," Daniel said calmly. The investigator flipped through his notes. "There's no record of that." Daniel allowed himself a faint smile. "There wouldn't be." The two investigators exchanged a glance. "What happened?" Daniel looked briefly at the humming fluorescent light. Then he said simply, "I was asked to leave." Silence settled in the room. The investigators continued writing. Procedure. Documentation. Outside the building, however, the story was evolving faster than they realized. Because somewhere inside Hail Dynamics, a decision had just been made. 32 floors above the frozen streets, the Hail Dynamics boardroom was louder than it had been in years. Board members argued across the long glass table. Investors demanded answers. Lawyers whispered urgently over tablets filled with legal exposure estimates. Victoria Hale stood near the window, watching the chaos with tight control. "We needed a suspect," one investor said bluntly. "And now we have one." Another board member frowned. "The investigation isn't finished." "It doesn't need to be," the investor replied. "As long as the public believes the breach came from outside the company." Victoria said nothing, but her silence was agreement. Then the conference room doors opened. A young engineer stepped inside. His name was Marcus Lynn, and 4 years earlier, he had been standing quietly near the reception desk when a janitor tried to explain an authentication flaw. Marcus had remembered the moment ever since. "Ms. Hale," he said carefully. Victoria didn't turn. "What is it?" "I've been reviewing archive server logs." Victoria sighed. "We've already done that." Marcus shook his head. "Not the old ones." That caught the room's attention. He connected a laptop to the presentation screen. A series of time-stamped records appeared. Old logs. 4 years old. Victoria finally turned. "What is this?" Marcus spoke carefully. "The original authentication architecture." Victoria frowned. "That's irrelevant." Marcus highlighted a section of code. "No," he said quietly. "It isn't." The room leaned closer. Because embedded deep within the logs was something unexpected. A diagnostic note. 4 years old. Inserted into the system by a junior engineer who had attempted to document the flaw Daniel had mentioned that night. Marcus read the comment aloud. "Potential packet injection vulnerability within authentication loop. Reported during investor demonstration. Issue dismissed." The boardroom went silent. Marcus continued scrolling. More logs appeared. Records showing repeated internal warnings about the same vulnerability. Warnings that had never reached the board. Warnings that had been buried inside internal reports. Warnings that had been quietly overridden by executive decision. Victoria's voice dropped dangerously low. "Where did you get those logs?" Marcus met her gaze. From the backup archive. One of the investors leaned forward slowly. You're saying this vulnerability existed for 4 years? Marcus nodded. And someone warned about it. Another pause. Then Marcus spoke the name that changed everything. Daniel Reyes? Across the city, in the quiet interrogation room, Daniel sat patiently while investigators reviewed another set of documents. Then the door opened. A third agent stepped inside. He carried a tablet. You need to see this, he said. The investigators looked up. The tablet displayed the archived logs Marcus had just uncovered. The lead investigator read the comment carefully. His expression changed. You reported this vulnerability 4 years ago? He asked Daniel. Daniel nodded once. Yes. And the company ignored it? Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached slowly into his jacket pocket. The investigators stiffened slightly. But Daniel simply removed a small flash drive. I made a copy of the network records when I started analyzing the breach, he said. He placed the drive gently on the table. I assumed someone might eventually need the full history. The investigators stared at him. Why didn't you present this earlier? Daniel's answer was quiet. Because no one had asked the right question yet. The lead investigator picked up the drive. On it were complete system logs. Time-stamped. Verified. Records showing exactly when the vulnerability had been discovered. Exactly who had been warned. And exactly who had chosen to ignore it. Back in the Hale Dynamics boardroom, tension thickened the air. Victoria's control was slipping. One investor spoke slowly. If these records are authentic, Marcus nodded. They are. Another board member leaned back heavily. Then the breach wasn't caused by an outside consultant. No one spoke the rest of the sentence aloud. But everyone understood it. The breach had been made possible by 4 years of ignored warnings. Warnings delivered by a man the company had thrown out of the building. The same man now being questioned for a crime he had tried to prevent. Across the city, Daniel stood as the investigators returned his belongings. You're free to go, the lead agent said. Daniel buttoned his coat calmly. Thank you. As he reached the door, the investigator asked one final question. Mr. Reyes? Daniel paused. Why didn't you expose them earlier? Daniel thought for a moment. Then he answered simply. Because the truth is stronger when it reveals itself. Outside, the snow had stopped falling. But across the city, inside the glass tower of Hale Dynamics, the storm was only beginning. And Victoria Hale was about to discover that the quiet man she once ordered out of her building was the one person she could no longer control. The morning air outside Hale Dynamics carried the clean, brittle cold that follows a winter storm. Sunlight spilled across the glass tower, reflecting sharply off the frozen sidewalks below. Snowbanks lined the edges of the street, their surfaces glittering like powdered glass under the pale sky. Daniel Reyes stood across the avenue with his hands in the pockets of his dark coat. For a long moment he simply looked at the building. 4 years earlier he had walked out of those doors carrying a mop bucket and a quiet humiliation that most men would have carried like a wound. But time had a strange way of reshaping moments. The tower looked smaller now. Not physically. But in the way certain places lose their power once you understand them. Behind him, a car door closed softly. Daniel turned. Sophia stepped onto the sidewalk, adjusting the scarf around her neck. She had grown taller in the past few years, her posture confident, her eyes sharp with the kind of curiosity that never accepted easy answers. You ready? She asked. Daniel nodded. They crossed the street together. The lobby doors opened automatically as they approached. Warm air rushed out to meet them. Inside, the building looked exactly as Daniel remembered it. Polished marble floors. Tall glass walls. The faint smell of lemon cleaning solution lingering in the air. Except today the atmosphere felt different. Quieter. More cautious. Employees gathered in small groups near the elevators, speaking in hushed voices. News of the investigation had spread overnight. Executives had resigned. Legal teams had arrived before dawn, and the board of directors had called an emergency meeting. Daniel and Sophia stepped into the lobby. For a moment, Daniel's eyes drifted to the corner where a janitor's supply cart stood beside the wall. A young cleaner pushed a mop slowly across the marble floor. Daniel watched him for a second. Then he nodded politely. The man nodded back. Invisible men often recognized each other. Mr. Reyes? Daniel turned. A woman in a navy suit approached quickly. Good morning, she said. The board is waiting for you. Sophia looked impressed. The board? She whispered. Daniel smiled faintly. Just a meeting. They rode the elevator to the 32nd floor. The doors opened onto the same conference room where Victoria Hale had once demonstrated her company's brilliance. But the atmosphere had changed completely. No investors laughed now. No executives spoke confidently about the future. The room felt heavier. More honest. The board members stood as Daniel entered. Several of them looked uncomfortable. One of the older directors cleared his throat. Mr. Reyes, thank you for coming. Daniel sat calmly at the end of the long table. Sophia waited quietly in a chair near the wall, watching everything with wide, observant eyes. The director continued. The investigation has confirmed the authenticity of the system logs. Daniel nodded. We understand now that you attempted to warn the company about the vulnerability 4 years ago. Yes. The director hesitated. And we understand that the breach occurred because those warnings were ignored. The room fell silent. Finally, another board member spoke. Victoria Hale submitted her resignation early this morning. No one seemed surprised. The first director folded his hands carefully. We would like to offer you a position here. Daniel remained still. Chief Security Architect, the director said. The title hung in the air. The salary attached to it was even larger. But Daniel did not react immediately. Instead, he glanced toward the window. The winter sunlight reflected off nearby towers. For a moment, he remembered another office. Another company. Another time when he had believed talent alone could change the world. Then he looked towards Sophia. She watched him with quiet pride. Daniel turned back to the board. I appreciate the offer, he said. But I won't accept that position. The directors exchanged confused looks. One leaned forward. May we ask why? Daniel considered the question. Then he answered simply. Because the best work I can do doesn't require a corner office. He slid a small folder across the table. Inside were design documents. Security frameworks. A blueprint for a new system architecture. Ethical. Transparent. Built to prevent the kind of silent vulnerability that had nearly destroyed the company. I'm willing to help rebuild the system, Daniel said. As an advisor. One of the board members studied the folder. You'd be turning down millions. Daniel shrugged slightly. Money solves fewer problems than people think. A quiet ripple of laughter passed around the room. Relief. Respect. The director nodded slowly. Then we would be honored to have you as an advisor. The meeting ended shortly after. As Daniel and Sophia rode the elevator back to the lobby, she nudged his arm. You just turned down a giant office, she said. Daniel smiled. I've cleaned enough of those to know they're overrated. The elevator doors opened. They stepped once more into the lobby. Sunlight streamed through the glass wall. The same marble floor stretched across the room. But something inside Daniel had shifted. Not pride. Not victory. Just a quiet sense of balance returning. They stepped outside together. The air felt warmer now. The snow along the sidewalks had begun to melt. Sophia walked beside him, her backpack slung casually over one shoulder. You know, she said thoughtfully, if you had told them who you were 4 years ago, none of this would have happened. Daniel considered that. Maybe. Why didn't you? He looked back once at the tall glass tower behind them. Then he answered gently. Because sometimes the world needs time to learn how to listen. They continued walking down the street. Cars moved past. People hurried to work. Life carried on as it always did. But for the first time in years, Daniel Reyes felt no need to disappear into the background. Not because the world had suddenly changed, but because the truth had finally caught up with it. And as father and daughter turned the corner, leaving the tower behind them, the quiet narrator of their story might have said one simple thing. The world often overlooks the quiet man sweeping the floor, until the day it realizes he was the only one who truly understood how the building was meant to stand.